So, Matt, you're looking very dapper. We're recording in person for once.
I know. Yeah, this is the first episode we've recorded in person, right?
Yeah.
I'm moist, but not from your presence. Sadly, from the rain.
Yeah. I didn't pick the best day to get you to come into studio, but I walked outside. You said I'm here, and I rang you. I was like, "Where are you?" I'm at the Sainsbury's across the road, sitting in a bus shelter, eating a Kit Kat.
Yeah, vegan Kit Kats. Who knew? Who knew there were vegan Kit Kats now?
Yeah.
Yeah, very nice. It's weird being here in person. I feel like I'm like you're Joe Rogan, and I'm like, I don't know what, Jordan Peterson or something.
I was going to say you're Jamie. That pulls up also. Matt, can you pull that up? Can you pull that up, Matt?
Or you're Howard Stern, and I'm the other one.
Who's the other one? I'm not old enough to have listened to Howard Stern, Matt. You called me Mr. Ben earlier on, and I feel like that's like a reference from back when they had gollywogs on the jam.
Yeah, R.I.P.
Yeah.
Political correctness gone mad.
Yeah. See, this is the thing. Tattooing's been ruined because of political correctness gone mad.
You can't say anything these days.
Yeah. We won't mention any tattooists in particular.
Are we going to be that kind of? Are we going to be that kind of podcast now, Thomas? We're gonna just seek the clicks. We're gonna get cancelled.
No, we get enough.
Go on a cancelled tour.
All of the lovely messages we've gotten from listeners about all the great work we're doing down the drain because we want to. Well, you could go down the Jordan Peterson route because you are now an academic who is also a content creator.
Yeah, but my 12 rules for life, like most of them would be
about moisturising.
9 of them would be have a nap, and then the other 3 would be about moisturising.
Yeah, run us through your skincare routine for anyone who has never met Matt or never seen him. Matt is in his 40s and has incredible skin. So
well, you know what? I got ID'd obviously earlier on the automatic checkouts at Sainsbury's for buying Monster. Right? If you buy energy drinks, you get ID checked. And the guy has come over, and rather than just pressing a button to say this guy is over the age of 16 to buy a Monster energy drink, there's a little box where the person has to put in a number of how old they think you look. And he put in 21, which is absurd because I definitely do not look 21.
I mean,
but
definitely take that as a compliment.
Well, I have very terrible skin. You were saying earlier on there's some billionaire who wants to be have the skin of when he was in his 20s. I do not want the skin of when I was in my 20s because I had very bad acne and disgusting greasy skin. So I am a devotee, I have to say. Please sponsor the show of Drunk Elephant. Okay. Yeah. So I tend to use Drunk Elephant cleanser. Their eye cream, which is like a game changer because I have heavy lids.
Okay.
If you do, you're welcome. And yeah, a little bit of moisturizer. Nice. Yeah, or the ordinary moisturizer because the Drunk Elephant stuff's really expensive. So a little bit of ordinary. Yeah, and it's very nice. Like it's very soft. And you're very welcome to Beneath the Skin. Beneath the Skin, the history of moisturising.
Literally going beneath the skin, talking about Matt's skincare routine.
There's that quote that I use in my book from that Elizabeth Arden campaign from 1933, where they advertised moisturiser basically, 100 years ago, basically saying, they say the world belongs to the sensitives. If it wasn't for those people who moisturize, we'd still be tattooing our skins and calling it painting, right? So having soft skin and not having tattoos is what separates us from the barbarians of our past, Thomas.
Yeah. Well, you're once again very welcome to the show that's about the history of everything told through the history of tattooing. And one person who definitely did not have good skin is one Francisco Franco. A great transition today.
That was your worst intro handbrake yet.
I mean, look, I got to figure it out somehow. Do you know what? Do you know what's very good for your skin?
I'm going to be the first one to say it. Dunking on Franco's skincare regime. That's the only bad thing to say about the guy.
But we are very blessed today to have an incredible guest to talk about something that probably not a lot of people know about. We're talking about tattooing in Spain. And Matt, do you want to introduce our wonderful guest?
Yeah, well, I mean, nobody knows about it really. And this is why I'm really delighted that our guest is here. So we are pleased to welcome Julia Amigo, who is doing a PhD in Granada. which we'll talk about. And she contacted me a couple of years ago and said, "Hey, I want to come to the UK for a bit and study in the UK as well." So she's been with me at the University of Essex for this academic year, which has been really good. And I've learned so much. I get a lot of emails from people who want to do work with me and PhD students, and lots of them are not very well formulated in terms of approaches. Julia's was amazing because she was just like, "Hey, I'm working at the moment on the history of women and tattooing in Spain. Do you know anything about it?" And quite often when people ask me, "Do you know anything about that?" I have to say, "Yeah, I know quite a lot." This I didn't know anything about at all, which proves to me it's a good project. So yeah, like I'm a big fan of yours, Julia. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Tom, for having me. I'm really happy. I'm a fan, so I'm really glad.
So yeah, when we were talking about this when we were at the Jesse Knight exhibition, or well, the collection, and I was asking you questions about it because it's honestly, I think in terms of like tattoo history, everyone kind of like thinks about tattooing in the UK, in America, in Asia, in Japan, obviously particular, and we forget that there is like a tattooing tradition, or there's at least a tattoo history, even if there is an absence of tattooing in different parts of the world, places like Spain, places like France, Germany, Ireland, which we will talk about at some stage, obviously me being Irish. But I think it's really interesting because obviously Spain's history is quite unique in terms of like Europe. So Julia, do you want to give us kind of a crash course introduction into tattooing in Spain?
Yeah, sure. So I think when you were talking about France or Germany, I think those countries are much more documented in terms of tattoo history, whereas
Germany for sure.
Yeah, whereas Italy, Portugal, Spain, Greece, I think are much more unknown, even though we have a tradition, right? In the case of Spain, our particular political history shaped what we know about tattooing, especially because from 1939 till 1975, we were under a dictatorship. And of course, subcultures were like not present, or they were highly repressed, which means that, of course, any body practice that was out of the norm was prosecuted. So even if we had, like soldiers, military people, or people in prisons getting tattooed, it's not very well documented. So if you go looking for sources, I was like, I really struggled. It's really hard to find any text or even photographs. But then after 1975, we start seeing how the first tattoo shops, on the streets of cities start opening. And that's when tattoo culture really launches off. Not before that time, I would say.
So you and I talked about this a lot. There's not really much evidence at all of a professional practice even before the 1930s in Spain, right?
Yeah, not much. And even though our history or our contact with tattooing goes like way back. Because even in 1632, right, this guy, Bernal Díaz del Castillo, when he got to what is Mexico now, right, he was a conqueror. He wrote this book on the history of the New Spain, he called it. And he was describing how native people were tattooed. He even used a term, which was taracear, that referred to like engraving the skin. Then we stopped using that term and we adopted tattooing, tatuaje, from the French probably. So yeah, there's like a huge gap where people were probably getting tattooed because, for example, the royal family were getting tattooed even like at the beginning of last century. And there are pictures, of their tattoos, but they were getting them, of course, in foreign countries, not in Spain.
King Alfonso, is that right? And
yes.
He's one of these like tattooed crowned heads of Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century, around the same time as Edward VII or George V or Tsar Nicholas II. Like that kind of trend for aristocratic tattooing, particularly in the context of Japan, like reached Spain.
Yeah,
the Spanish royal family.
Yeah,
too.
And both his sons, Jaime and Juan, got tattooed by George Burkett, for example.
Yeah.
So there was presence of tattooing, right? But it was mainly either for very rich people that could afford to travel, or for just prisoners and so-called criminals.
So what happens then to tattooing during the period when Franco's in power? So he comes to power, as you said, in 1939.
Mhm.
And so is tattooing banned? Like, is tattooing suppressed in the Spanish military or the Spanish Navy? Like, what's happening to tattooing in the 30s in Spain?
It wasn't really banned, but even before then, we didn't have any tattoo shops, right, on the streets. So I know that for that time, right, like 1920s, even 1910s, newspapers were starting to, get an interest in tattooing. So they were describing how, for example, English people were getting tattooed a lot. There were lots of articles with photographs, and people were, I think, starting to get interested. There was this party, for example, in Madrid in 1912 called La Fiesta del Tatuaje, where just artists would paint with painting, right? It wasn't tattooing, but it was like a pretend
a body painting thing,
body painting on cabaret women, and that was, I think, a first sign of people getting interest, right, in tattooing and tattoo culture. But of course, after Franco got into power, any diversity actually was repressed. I don't think tattooing was banned. I couldn't find any information on it being banned. But if you think about, for example, how women who would live alone couldn't have people in their houses, or they couldn't, smoke, that gives you an idea of how repression was working. It was very intense. So anything that was underground, subcultural, would just go prosecuted.
Yeah, and Spain, I guess, a history that we don't get taught really at all in the UK, just disgustingly and shockingly, I suppose. But it's really interesting to me how quickly, Germany, France, Italy and Spain, how they go from, in the 20s, post-World War I, these very bohemian, interconnected kind of European cultural communities. I think that 1912 example you're talking about is very reflective of what's happening in Paris and what's happening in London and what's happening in various bits of Germany as well. But how quickly the particular context in Spain and Germany transform the social landscape, particularly for kind of deviants, and particularly for kind of anyone that's not considered within the kind of acceptable range of quite normal human behavior as far as the fascists are concerned, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, after the 60s, even after the 50s, I would say Spain started opening to the world a little bit more. But I think by 1975, people were eager to just explore. For example, punk. We only started getting, like a punk scene, a big one, a known one, after the death of Franco.
Yeah.
So it was like many years after you started it, for example, here. Yeah. So I think people were just eager.
And shout out Los Vulpes.
Yeah, exactly.
I was going to ask, because obviously we've done an episode about tattooing and the alt-right and fascism, and obviously for anyone who isn't very familiar with the topic, like, fascism is essentially a project of, in terms of like culture, is of social control, eliminating kind of the creases in the homogeneity of a culture. And I just want to ask, obviously you talked about like subculture didn't really exist. What was there an underground scene at the time? Was there stuff even, that wasn't as visible internationally? What was the underground scene like? Did people have tattoos? What was going on?
There was an underground scene for sure. It's not like well documented, but mainly because it was better for you not to document anything. And then I think tattooing is such a visible thing that maybe, things were happening and we just didn't see them happening, right? And for example, in the 50s, there's a couple of tattooers from Europe that were coming to Barcelona to tattoo, like Ron Akers from here, and then Albert Cornelissen from Germany. They were, of course, tattooing mainly military people, but I'm sure probably, they would tattoo also just regular people who were interested in tattooing. I'm just wondering if there's any place where we could find that information. I guess we should like talk to the families or
keep looking. I mean, I think like this is the Ron Akers story. So Ron Akers, bought a van, didn't he, and drove all over Europe. He even talks in his little book about rolling a dice or flipping a coin or something, going, should we go to Spain or should we go to Italy or whatever in the 50s and 60s. But I think the fact that Akers and Cornelissen, who's a part of that group too, like again, it just shows like weirdly what we were saying a minute ago, like the UK, German, American, that nexus that's coming through like the Bristol Tattoo Club and through the London tattoo sort of offshoot of the Bristol Tattoo Club with Jesse and Cash Cooper, and like that British scene that's like at the heart of so much of what's happening. It's so funny to me that even in this very dark, strange, complicated moment of Spanish tattoo history, you've got like Ronnie Akers, who was one of the first people in the UK to be a correspondent of Ed Hardy's, who was very friendly and a bit of a rival of Jesse's, who was working right the way up and, going to Japan with like Lau Hardy in the 70s and 80s. Like, it's really interesting how these single figures seem to pop up all over the place because the numbers of people that are doing tattooing are so small. Like, I mean, what's your sense of like, I mean, you talked a bit about it, but how those networks begin to develop in the 50s and 60s?
Mm. I don't know much about those years because, as I said, it's really hard to find sources, right? But I know that the first guy to open a tattoo shop in Spain, Mao Perez, who opened his shop in the south in 1981, along with this photographer who's very well known in Spain, Garcia Alix, he learned how to tattoo with Lou in Switzerland. So again, the connections are there. Yeah. I think it's much easier to look at them and understand the conversation after Franco's death.
Philip Lou, whose dad Felix Lou had learned to tattoo from Jock in Piccadilly. Again, like part of that mad scene. So what happens in the 70s? Like the thing that you said to me that blew me away the other day was such a good point. Like I spend my life, trying to kind of dispel this idea that there was a tattoo renaissance. We hear this a lot in academic literature that somehow tattooing had gone away, and then Ed Hardy and Cliff Raven and art school trained tattooers in the 70s rebirth tattooing and turn tattooing into this art form again. That's something that you'll find in a lot of writing. I've found references to the renaissance of tattooing right back to the 50s at least, and I think it's a kind of nonsense term because tattooing never really goes away. But as you pointed out to me the other day, in honestly a thought that blew my mind, like in Spain the renaissance of tattooing is true because there's no tattooing, and then all of a sudden the first wave of tattooing really is this post Ed Hardy, post art school, kind of wave, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember I went to your office that day and I asked you about artification and Renaissance. And I was like, I've always been very critic or skeptic about these two topics. And then we discussed a little about it. And then I was like, wait, but actually Renaissance really applies to Spain, because it is true that it's only after 1975 that tattoo culture really starts to develop and people actually start seeing tattooed bodies, because it's also true that people, I think, were like eager to show their tattoos, right? So it really applies for the Spanish case.
And my sense is that in that 1980s Spain, there is a real kind of not breathing a sigh of relief was not quite the right word, but there's a big kind of like release of energy. There's a real vibrant scene very quickly, not just of tattooing, but of music and of fashion and of film. Like, so what's happening that that first tattoo shop, where in Spain was that?
It was in the south.
In the south.
Yes, because actually in the south, particularly in Cádiz, there were tattoo shops in the military base, right? Like related to, again, the military practices. And then it was there that Mao opened the first shop. And then slowly you start seeing how shops start opening in Barcelona, for example, then Madrid, then I think Bilbao. So it was mainly coastal towns or the main, Madrid, right? The main city.
Yeah. And this is, I mean, 100 years after the first tattoo shop in Britain and 130 odd years after the first tattoo shop in the United States. So it's kind of amazing how quickly this scene develops.
It is. And if you think about it nowadays, the tattoo scene in Spain is huge. We've got really good artists.
Incredible.
Yeah, and they are like very well connected, right? So they travel, and we have also many foreign guests. So it is really incredible to think about how just fast it all developed.
And you've obviously really spent a lot of your time over the recent years like talking about and to women who've been involved in tattooing almost from those early days, from the 80s or from the 90s. So tell us about that. Like, who are those women, and what are their stories? And again, I think what I find so interesting about the Spanish case and your research, Julia, is that there's a real like overblown sense in the Anglophone literature, like, oh, they're, you know, oh my God, women are getting tattooed now, shock horror, for a very long sustained period of time. And there, of course, as we talked about when we talked about Jessie, there have been women in Britain tattooing for a long time. But again, in Spain, it really is kind of new. But of course, these women that you've interviewed are coming into and being part of an industry that, even though it's new in Spain, does have all this cultural baggage that it has from its connections to elsewhere, and the general social stereotypes about gender and about tattooing anyway. So yeah, like how do women fit into this story, and what have you found in talking to the people you've been interviewing?
Mm-hmm. So I've interviewed 20 people, but I was talking to 3 tattooers, 3 women who were particularly interesting. 2 of them came from abroad. One is Isa, who learned how to tattoo in Amsterdam when she was 15. And she's an amazing character.
She is absolutely incredible. So we maybe like tell us the overview, and then we'll cycle back to them individually.
Okay. Yeah, so it was interesting to talk to the 3 of them, because when I started...
So Isa...
Yeah, it's Isa. She was known as Morbella, like back in the days, because she would dress as a vampire, which is also really interesting. Then I talked to Andrea. She was born in England, and her father was a tattooer, so she learned the trade because of her family, right? And he came to Spain in the 80s with her husband, and she decided to open a tattoo shop in Valencia in 1984. And then the last one is Mara. She's from Santander, so the north, and she's the only Spanish one. And her story is amazing because she would decide to go to Ibiza, this this island in Baleares. She would go there alone. She was a single mom of 4 kids, and she was just really into craft and art. And then she saw this tattooed man, and apparently he had, I think it was a dolphin or a mermaid, and she was amazed. It was, I think, in his belly or his chest. And then she thought, oh, I want to learn how to do that. So her story is quite amazing. And then she like sold her van. She had a van, and she decided to sell the van just in order to get the money necessary to learn how to tattoo with this Canadian tattooer.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So right at the beginning of this sort of emergence, you've got several really important women involved in the scene, so to speak.
Yeah, and they were really passionate, I think, about tattooing. That's like what they have in common. Then their styles are really different, but they were just, really passionate. And I remember talking to them and realizing how, even though there were obstacles, of course, for them, especially being women in the scene and in the Spanish society, that was still a little close and a little, like tattooed bodies were getting very stigmatized. They were very resilient. Like their stories show how they would just resist in many different ways, which is, I think, the most important.
So let's talk about them individually then. So I cut you off because on Isa, but maybe we can start with her. Like, tell us about her.
Yeah, so Isa Morbella, she's just an amazing character. She learned how to tattoo in Amsterdam when she was 15. Then she kept tattooing, and at some point she decided she wanted to learn how to bullfight. Because as she told me, and this is incredible, she just wanted to go to these male-dominated professions just to say, oh, look, I can do it as well.
And she's Dutch.
She's Dutch, yeah. And so she decided to go to Mexico, where she learned how to bullfight, and she bullfighted for many years there professionally. And then she wanted to just, change environment, and she just decided to come to Andalusia, the southern region in Spain, only because there was bullfighting there as well. So she came like mid-80s, I think, to Andalusia, or late 80s, and she kept bullfighting for a bit. Then,
was that, I mean, as a vegan, I have to kind of condemn bullfighting generally, but I still think this is...
man, it's okay.
I still think this is just an amazing, badass story. Were women bullfighting in Spain? So she's also this pioneer in bullfighting as well.
Yeah. She was just a pioneer in everything. Yeah, she was really brave. And I remember she talked to me about bullfighting because people, of course, judge her. Right, judge her as a bullfighter, but then she told me that it was very different back in the days because it was like a poor people thing. So it was even it had connections with anarchism, for example, and then of course society started just canceling bullfighting, and that's the moment when she decided to just stop bullfighting and get back into tattooing. And so she opened her own shop in Malaga, which is another city from Andalusia, with her partner as well. And yeah, she's been tattooing ever since. She's not in Malaga anymore. She travels now. She's in Amsterdam at the moment. And now she tattoos, I think, in a different way because she enjoys just talking to the client. Yeah. So she would complain to me about how things are different now. And
all old school tattooers are like that. All old people are like that. I think that's very standard.
You're speaking from experience, man.
Well, I am, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, I think but her kind of back in the day story. Back in the day, kids were bullfighting. It's like, that's a bit of a different vibe.
Just before we move on to talking about the other two, one thing that struck me is it seems like these women's stories are kind of enmeshed with the feminist revolution in Spain from the 80s onwards. Obviously, as you see subculture developing and bursting into the mainstream, how were women's roles changing in Spain in general? Because as you mentioned, women couldn't smoke, they couldn't have people in their house. How was that changing rapidly?
Yeah, and this
from
is
the 80s
obviously
onwards?
Also the time of global feminism is second wave feminism is the 70s anyway. So again, it's this interesting moment where things that are happening elsewhere in Europe and the world happen differently in Spain, but at the same time. I don't know enough about the history of Spain to know what the cause and effect relationship is, but yeah,
so for example, just a fact, in 1978, that was a date that the first national conference of feminist organizations happened in Spain, which is really late. But again, of course, women were already organized before, and there was resistance, even if there was repression, of course, there were women that were, discussing things, debating, even fighting, especially in the late Francoism, right? But yeah, it was only after 78 that society really started to talk about it, to talk about feminism openly. And for example, at universities, we started seeing gender studies as model, not before that, of course. So it was also a very quick change, I would say. And I think women were already, sneaking through law and repression in their own unique ways, you know, before Franco died.
Hey, are you enjoying the show? If you really like Beneath the Skin and you want to help support us, you can do so on Patreon. For little as £5 a month, you can help make this show possible. help us buy research materials. So if you like the show and you want to support us, consider kicking us a few quid a month. And you'll get everything from bonus episodes to Q&As, and you can even vote on what tattoo I'll get when we reach a certain subscriber count. Matt, have you got anything to say?
You should really definitely fund the Patreon, because tattoo history is massive, right? Deep, wide, complicated. We're covering some big hit topics on the main feed, but on the Patreon subscriber-only feed, we'll be getting into some really more interesting, niche, deep topics you don't want to miss out on. And honestly, the chance to kind of decide what Thomas gets on his body is probably just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Subscribe, chuck us a few quid. Don't miss out on the chance to ruin Thomas's body forever.
Everyone knows that tattoo aftercare is one of the most important steps in getting a new tattoo. We all want our fresh new tattoos to heal as easily and hassle-free as possible so we can show them off to the world.
That's why Sanoderm's here to help. Driven by science and innovation, Sanoderm products have been thoroughly tested and used by doctors and tattoo artists alike for over 10 years.
Sanoderm brings cutting-edge technology to make your tattoo healing process a breeze. No more messing around with cleaning and plastic every few hours with Sanoderm's amazing range of aftercare products. I personally have used Sanoderm to heal my tattoos in the past, and they made what used to be a daily process of setting reminders on my phone to clean and rewrap my tattoo into a one-step process.
Their medical-grade products include aftercare balms, soaps, and my favourite, their second skin aftercare bandages. Sanoderm's tattoo bandages are designed to be waterproof, breathable, and keep your new tattoo protected from whatever the elements can throw at it, so you can get on with your day, worry-free, and confident your new tattoo will look vibrant and will heal faster.
Plus, their products are all natural and ethically sourced, so you can take comfort in knowing that you're healing your tattoos with nature's finest ingredients.
So next time you're in an artist's chair, why not try Sanoderm, healing your tattoos the modern way so you can get on with your day.
Check out the link in the description of this episode for discounts on a range of Sanoderm products or for more information.
Just the last thing on Issa, she's also a remarkable looking woman, right? Like she photographed a lot. There's quite a lot of photos of her from her over her career. She's got some amazing tattoos as well. Like, can you just maybe describe what she looked like?
Yeah, she's a heavily tattooed woman.
Yeah.
She's got like neck, hands, face, and she was telling me her story. She really liked to get tattooed by friends and fellow tattooers who she admired. And she's got amazing stories for each of her tattoos, I think. So they are like souvenirs from her travels, because she's been also in India, in Mexico, as I said. So she's like a good traveler. And I think I was particularly amazed by 3 dots in each cheek in her face. Because she's a huge fan of Wally Meyers, who's this Australian artist who was also a tattooer, like at some point. She tattooed Patti Smith, for example, and this Wally had 3 dots in each cheek on her face. So she decided to get that tattoo done by her friend Isa, because she wanted like to homage her idol.
And what's her own tattooing like? What's her style?
So
like?
she's a really good illustrator as well. She's done, for example, covers for Penguin or for, I don't know, music bands and stuff. Her style is very intricate, is very complex. It's got lots of color. It's like, I would say, similar to traditional, but she's got like a very special take on it. It's really interesting. I recommend people to check her stuff out.
I think that's really interesting that you, when you have this tattoo culture sort of coming very quickly in that context, you sort of, you get that, I mean, again, that kind of new style, post-Ed Hardy, post-Spiderweb kind of stuff, without having to go through all the stuff beforehand. It's really, really interesting. So who was your next interviewee?
The next one was Andrea. She's the English one. She learned because of her father, which is also interesting for me in terms of her, of course, coming from the UK.
And who was her father?
Will Hakon. and he was working, I think, in Jersey Islands for a while. Then he was with the military as well, and she learned, I think, when she was young, and then she decided to come to Valencia, and that's in the coast, and she opened her studio there with her partner. And of course, when they opened, it was really hard to get like regular clients, so they were doing other stuff on the side, right? Like her husband, she told me, was picking up oranges, for example, which are like a huge thing in Valencia, while they were also tattooing for the first years.
Wow. I mean, again, that's exactly what was happening in the early days of tattooing in the United States, for example, or where tattooers would run photo studios, pubs, as print shops, sign writing, as well as tattooing. In Germany in the 1930s, Christian Warlick ran a tattoo studio / pub. So again, it's really interesting that these early days, and you haven't got a kind of critical mass of clients, and you're not like Ron Acker showing up in a van, you're trying to have a permanent studio. You've got to figure out how to make that work if you want to be a pro tattooer. That's so interesting.
You got to get that side hustle. You got to have something on the side going.
Yeah. I think that's so interesting. And she was also kind of connected into the British scene a bit, wasn't she? She knew a lot of those guys.
Yeah, I think she had some tattooers from abroad as well visiting the studio, and at some point she told me that there were 12 tattooers working at the same time in the studio.
Wow.
And they also had this magazine. It was, I think, one of the first in Spain. She would travel a lot those years. She would go to conventions. So she was, very well connected.
Because that's also a kind of really interesting, kind of important moment in general for European tattoo conventions, right? Like Dunstable in Britain, and like the Amsterdam Tattoo Convention was very important at that time. And a lot of the artists in that period, the young artists like Lau Hardy or Alex Binney or Hanky Panky, they are again building that next generation of networks. And it's really interesting that the Spanish artists were very quickly part of that European scene.
Yeah, exactly. She also knew, for example, Isabel Varley. So she told me some stories on her going to conventions, people even recognizing her, like having fans, which is also I think a great sign that she was known and relevant.
Yeah, and you and I were looking through some of the old kind of tattoo books from that period, from the late 80s, like particularly the Chris Wroblewski Skin Shows books, and there are a couple of Spanish people in those books, and he was largely working in London, but he would photograph people in Germany, in Holland, in the United States on occasion. There's even some Spanish people in those books, right? So there's clearly this
I was amazed
connection.
because I told myself, okay, I had to come all the way to Essex, to find like photos from tattoo culture from the 80s, which is quite funny.
And is Andrea still tattooing? She's still working?
No, not really, but her shop is still open. It's called Tatuarte, and her son is now like the owner or alongside with her, and he does Japanese traditional.
Amazing. And then who was your third?
My third was Mara. She's the only Spanish one, like born in Spain. And as I said, she was interested in arts and crafts. And at some point, she just saw this tattooed man, and she was just amazed by it. And she really just decided to go for it. So she sold her van and just asked this Canadian guy to teach her how to tattoo.
And was that in Ibiza?
No, she learned in Barcelona. And then I'm not sure if it was like before or after that she would start tattooing. But I remember that she told me when she was in Ibiza already tattooing, she would just hang her number in clubs, mainly in clubs. And she would just receive calls like 3 a.m. in the morning. Hey, can I get a tattoo? And then she would like get her stuff, go to the club and tattoo there.
This is like me putting slap stickers for this show on every cistern and every pub that I see.
Were you surprised? I mean, because you obviously like came at this with a huge amount of knowledge, having been yourself. You weren't a tattoo, but you'd been a body piercer, and you had a whole kind of really an instinct, I think, a really good instinct about what it was like to be a woman in these industries. But what did you learn, or what surprised you from talking to these women, the three you've mentioned, and the tattooed customers that you've interviewed as well? Like, what was the process for you of like discovery with the research?
I think what struck me the most was the fact that they were like very resilient. That's what I would say, because we tend sometimes, like even feminists themselves, we tend to victimize women in a way, or to highlight the fact that they were facing many obstacles and they were suffering, and they were not as relevant as their fellow tattooers. And whereas when I talked to them, I realized that they were just really not suffering at all. I mean, of course, they would, get bad looks, comments, but that didn't stop them from doing what they wanted to do. And I remember Isa, for example, telling me that it was easier back in the days to just present yourself as a woman and just say, hey, this is what I want to do. I don't care about what you think.
Yeah.
Whereas now she was telling me that many times with younger male tattooers, she struggles because they just, like, especially now that she's older, they just, don't take her seriously.
Yeah, it's really amazing that, I mean, it's not amazing. It's obviously all too sadly routine, but if you think about how highly regarded many of her peers are, people of her generation are, it's not surprising, but it's sad. It's a sad indictment of our whole cultural conversation that these women who were able to do what they did because they were forging this world for themselves. They were making space for themselves. They didn't have to, there wasn't competition in the same way, so they didn't have to deal with that bullshit, and they could just be, they could create something unencumbered. It's sad that these younger, I imagine that a lot of these younger people you're talking about are absorbing their histories of tattooing from reading about the United States and Britain, because the history of what's happened in Spain is so opaque, even to people who are probably tattooers in Spain, right? Like, I get the impression from talking to you that a lot of tattoo artists, even in Spain, don't know the history, even this recent history, right?
Yeah, I've talked to many younger woman tattooers, and I tend to ask them if they know any other like older woman tattooer. And many of them don't know much, but I think it's mainly because the conversation has been around male tattooers, right? That's very common, but that happens in any male-dominated industry or culture. So I think it's just important that we talk about them and write about them and just remember those stories, because I think those first ones need to be remembered and to be part of the conversation, because they were, going to conventions, they were just being really brave, just creating magazines, opening up studios.
Yeah.
And I think that in Spain in particular, but in general, we just tend to talk more about male tattooers. Like, even when I listen to your podcast, I'm sorry,
it's
or
fair.
when I read books, it's mainly male tattooers that we discuss about. And not only in terms of the culture or the tattoos themselves, but just like in general.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I want, I think we all need to do better on that. I mean, I was really, we mentioned this in the Jessie episode, but like one of the reasons why Jessie's so interesting as a female tattooer is not because she's the first person to pick up a tattoo machine who's a woman. She's not, but because many of the other women who we do talk about are women who were wives or daughters of tattoo artists. And like, Jessie was the daughter of a tattoo artist too, but she wasn't taught by him really, and she worked on her own, build a reputation separate from him. But like, many of the women whose names we know who were tattooing in the early part of the 20th century in Britain were doing so in the context of like their husband's shops or their uncle's shops or their dad's shops or whatever. And so, yeah, and that is, again, we see this in art history generally too, right? Like even when we're talking about great female artists like Dora Maar or Helen Frankenthaler, we often have to say, oh, Muse of Picasso, wife of Jackson Pollock or whatever, like there's a horrible patriarchal tendency to do that, and I think it's really good that you're calling us out on that because it's
Get our
important.
ass.
But also, actually, I have to say this as well. I think what's super interesting about the kind of blank slate of Spanish history that you're engaging with is that, weirdly, because there isn't that existing set of narratives that you have to work against necessarily, so you can really write this history not entirely from scratch, but like, you haven't got to kind of say, oh, you just thought it was all men, but actually it's women too. You can talk about these amazing women without having to, apologize or recontextualize them in an existing set of narrative.
Yeah, and I think as well that I'm going to try and say the word that I only say right 50% of the time. You don't have the historiographic baggage that comes with talking about, say, tattooing in Britain or in the US or even in other parts of Europe, that like there is so much of it that exists already and people will only dig so much further past that. Whereas like what you're doing now is you are creating, I suppose, the canon of Spanish tattoo history.
I mean, that's maybe too much. But yeah, I feel like when I decided to focus on women's experiences, right, I decided to do so because, we tend not to tell their stories or just diminish them. So I found like...
Yeah, I think there's also something... It's not quite the opposite of that, but it's also complement. So there's lots of books, good books indeed, about tattooed women, like Margot Mifflin's books and Amelia Osterrod's books about tattooed women. But they tend to be quite reductive in a way because they're often not taking full account of, as you said, almost as you said earlier on about how women's histories are seen as sort of different or separate from men's histories sometimes, which they should be. But I think what I'm trying to say is those books, as valuable and important as they are, they do tend to kind of hive off women's history in some senses from the broader histories that they exist as part of. And I think sometimes people try and do gender studies work on tattooing far too, and I'm not including those two books I've just mentioned in it, but there's plenty of other stuff which is like divorced from the historical context, and therefore they start off with a really wrong place. Women weren't getting, because they believe, lots of researchers who aren't so attuned to tattoo history, who are writing about tattooed women, will say, well, women weren't getting tattooed until 2005, right? Because that's what they've read in other places, and then actually the more complicated history mucks up their theorizing.
And I think as well, it's the difference between, and I think it goes for a lot of study of tattooing writ large, is that like the viewing of the women more as a subject rather than a participant. Like you talk about the like all the histories of like tattooed women, particularly in participations in freak shows. A lot of the history, and this is from my own research for the show that we do on the Patreon, is they're viewed as subjects to be analyzed rather than like they were active participants in a culture to be understood.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking about my own views into tattooing, because I think that's also important. I understand tattooing as a corporal practice, right? Because it's always a collaboration. It's always an experience. It's not only the tattoo itself, but what happens before, what happens during the session, what happens after the session. And I think that also changes your approach to tattooing itself or to tattoo history. And in my case, for example, I remember reading many articles, like academic articles, on how women get tattooed in a less showy way, for example, especially during the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. And then I was thinking, yeah, maybe that's right, but we need to problematize that. It's not that like we can just take it for granted. Because if you think about it, if a woman in Spain were to get tattooed in the 90s, and of course she would like probably choose a place that was a little hidden. If you just tell the story like that, then it's going to seem like a much simple thing. Yeah. But it was actually complicated. It's like if you put it into context and you think about what happened in Spain and how women's relations to their own bodies was very shaped by the dictatorship and repression, then you understand much better, right?
Yeah, it's like the flattening of history rather than like looking at it from both an intersectional viewpoint, but also from something in, once again, historiographic, in how we understand their role in society and culture of the particular culture of Spain at the time.
Yeah, well, this is why tattoo history, again, what we try and do on the podcast, right? Like, why tattoo history is so important and interesting from this angle. Because if you, as you said, if you just treat it as like, oh, some women got some tattoos in Spain and they're quite similar to the tattoos that were getting done in, in Britain, you miss out on all this really important context. From both directions, there's an overdetermination from one way, there's an overdetermination from the other way. But actually, as you said, the context here is super interesting. And even though that tattooing on women in Spain has a kind of globalized context, that globalized context itself is interesting because that globalized context is what's new in Spain, right? So there's this new articulation of a particular kind of way of being a young woman and a way of being a embodied subject that is really new in itself. And tattooing is if you come at it with a reductive, like, tattoos are a mark of resistance or whatever, this very reductive way of thinking about it, you miss out on all this much more complicated stuff.
And indeed much more interesting stuff as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think like, I know that you obviously are not a historian, or at least you didn't start off doing a lot of history. You're technically a sort of anthropologist methodologically, aren't you? So you're
the klaxon is
again, Julia's one of my one of the good ones. One of the good ones. But also, but this is where my question's leading. Actually, I think what you found, certainly as you've been trying to make sense of your project at the end, right, is that if you're just trying to ask questions of people and taking them at their word, or taking the, as you said, as sort of a straightforward thing, you miss out on a lot of the context, right? So I don't know, like, how you found that process of taking what these women have told you, and you've learned from speaking to so many people, comparing what they have to say with the experiences that you've read of other anthropologists who've interviewed women in the same period in the United States, where most of this research comes from, and then putting it into historical context. Like, how has like contextualizing these conversations and comparing them to the United States and thinking about them in a historical context, like, changed how you've dealt with the material?
Yeah, I think it's been mainly since I got here to Essex that I started thinking in a more historical way, and that's been because of you, Matt. So thank you.
I don't think. No, that's not true. You came to me because you wanted to do more of that, not because I taught you how to do it. That's you were already thinking about that before you came, which is
Matt,
why I asked you.
Matt, you are the scaffolding, not the building.
I'm not even the scaffolding. But thank you for saying so. But I don't quite think it's true. But,
but I mean, I remember when I started, for example, looking at newspapers. That was really interesting, for example, because I could see that there was this interest in Spanish society before the dictatorship into just starting talking about tattooed bodies and tattooing as a culture, and then how it all stopped. The conversation stopped during the dictatorship, of course, and then it like resurrected. And then I remember I would start just like increasing the complexity of my approach, because I would read those books that I really admire. I really admire some of the sources on women and tattoos in the West. But then I remember thinking that those books don't really apply to the Spanish case or many other cases, right? Even though Spain is considered a Western country. And then I was like, okay, so what can I do? I need to just put into conversation my findings in terms of the ethnographic data, right? Like my interviews, my field notes and everything. I need just to put into conversation with first the history of Spain, and then those stories that have been told on women and tattooing that are not really like correct in a way. So I like to think about this particular story of my grandma, who got separated from my grandpa like 5 years ago. And then she told me that she wanted to get a tattoo. And I was really happy because I know it was partly because of me and my sister being tattooed women. And then she was like, you know what? I'm going to do it now. Now that I'm not with your grandpa, I'm going to get...
How old is your grandma?
She's 79 now, or 78. Yeah, but she looks awesome.
Big up Julia's grandmother.
Yeah, so she told me that she wanted to get a tattoo, and we went to the tattoo shop. It was a friend's owned tattoo shop in my hometown in Granada. And I remember that afternoon when she came out of the tattoo shop and we were walking back home and we were talking, and she was like, oh, it was actually not that bad. It didn't hurt much. She got she got like a little Buddha on her hip because her yoga teacher died. And that was like the Buddha that she gave her as a present. So she wanted to just keep it like as a souvenir from her. And then I remember I was very emotional. I was feeling very emotional. And I have, thought about that moment for a while now. And I understand why I was emotional. She was emotional as well. We were just feeling really great. I remember this huge smile on her face, right? And if you tell that story and you don't know much about what was going on in Spain when she was born or when she was, like growing old, you don't really think about it as something relevant. Whereas if you put it into conversation with what was her childhood, her teenage years, what was her life as a mother, her life now that she's recently separated from my grandfather, it is amazing. It turns into like this kind of little revolution for her gender, for, I don't know, her generation.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I think I'm sad that I can't speak Spanish and read your stuff directly, but I'm super excited to try and read it, even using translation tools, because there's a lot of stuff out there, good work and not so good work, about tattooed women, interviewing tattooed women about their experiences, but they do tend to be very reductive. And what I love about what you're doing is it isn't reductive. It is really rich and really important and really like genuinely enlightening in a way that I think a lot of tattoo scholarship sadly isn't. So yeah, thank you for doing all the amazing stuff you're doing. I wonder if I can ask you like a final set of questions just about how this fits in generally with how Spain at the moment, like contemporary Spanish scholarship and Spanish society is thinking about the dictatorship. So as I said, we don't get taught much about the history of Spain and the Spanish context at all in Britain. And so, but having lived in Germany and been a linguist and studied, for example, how Germany post-war and now still is like deals with culturally and politically its own history, like how in general is the conversation in Spain about the Franco years, now that people like your grandmother who were young during it are getting older? And how does the tattoo history, do you think, relate to some of those more wider conversations about reckoning with the gender histories and the political histories and the broader histories of Spain? Like, what's that conversation like?
Well, sadly, the work that we have been doing with memory in Spain is not really good. We tend not to talk about it enough, and even politically or in terms of legislation, we are not doing a great work. Because if you think about it, we still have like many streets or even statues, that remember those years, and it just makes no sense. And of course, there are different governments in different regions that are trying to change the conversation and investigate what happened during those years. But if you think about it, we still have many unidentified bodies in our cities and woods, and they are there. We don't know who they are. It's really sad. I don't think we're doing a good job in those terms. But I believe that talking about specifically tattoo culture is just a good opportunity to try and start opening a conversation also around how repression worked in Spain. Because if you think about it, it's like very transparent that there was so much repression and prosecution of diversity that it just literally stopped many things from happening. And it's really interesting to think about the fact that it's only after Franco's death that these things start to be visible in society. So I think we could do this with many other things, but tattooing is like a good opportunity because it's like very clear that it couldn't happen, at least in a commercial level, right? Like,
I remember once having a conversation with a tattooist from Poland, and most of the Eastern Bloc under the Soviet Union, in East Germany and in Yugoslavia, and the whole kind of Soviet sphere of influence, as well as the Soviet Union, also banned tattooing. And he said something really similar to me that, and that, obviously that was again much later. That was like 1989 and 1988, 1989. He said the similar things happened in Poland, for example, after the fall of communism, that they all of a sudden had tattoo shops, and this subcultural practice like became a really important nexus point for thinking about because tattooing often has a memorial function anyway, and the corporeality of fascism and dictatorship and authoritarianism is really important. So yeah, I think I don't know, it strikes me as a really interesting, again, in a way that isn't true everywhere. What you're doing is a really interesting way of thinking about all kinds of other things, like what specifically changes and what doesn't change, I suppose, as well, between the Franco era and the post-Franco era, like, and talking to women now, and talking to, I mean, you talked to quite a lot of young women as well, didn't you, who have tattoos? Like, how are they relating to these histories, or are you finding that their narratives are a bit flatter?
No, their narratives are really interesting, especially because they are like, let's say, more open to the European context, for example, because they travel more. I've talked to people who has also worked in Canada, for example, for a while, and you see the differences. Like, they tell you how, for example, in Canada, tattoo shops are much more inclusive. How, for example, harassment there is like very well controlled, whereas in Spain this is still a problem. Like, we are recently starting this conversation on catcalling, on abuse during tattoo sessions. Those are conversations that we are starting now. Whereas I think in the UK, I've been reading for a while about work from, for example, Alice Snape on these topics. So their stories are very interesting as well and relevant. And even though they are young, I think they are very aware of the history, and some of them are also related to the punk scene, for example. So they've got stories on that as well. So it's not only about tattooing, it's about many other subcultures or underground scenes.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a perfect way to end it. I'm going to play the outro music of Spanish Bombs, but if you, what's the Spanish band that did a Spanish language cover of Spanish Bombs? Oh, I'm trying to remember. Oh, I'll remember it. But that's just a fascinating conversation. I'm kind of like lost for words on what to say. But if you've enjoyed this episode, Julia, where can people find your work? Where can they find you?
I'm on Instagram, Julia Amigo, and that's pretty much it. I'm not much more into social media these days, so that's it.
And if you enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more, we have a good back catalogue that we've been building up. You can hear more on Patreon as well. Your episodes like this early and our bonus content. You can find us on social media. The links are all down below. And yeah, if you subscribe to the £15 tier, you get a signed copy of Matt's book shipped to you, sealed with a kiss.
Yeah, and a press of my pillowy skin.
There's just a faint hint of moisturizer on every book.
Yeah, slightly greasy. That's how it goes. Thank you so much, Julia. It's been such a pleasure. Having you at Essex, you've taught me so much, and I'm really excited about the work you're doing in a way that I often am not. This is like the second episode we've recorded in a row where I've chatted to someone whose work I've been a big fan of. Like when we I don't know which order these are going to go out in, but the last episode we recorded was the episode with Anne Austen, whose work I also love and who taught me a lot. So it's rare actually that people teach me loads of stuff about tattoo history. And Julia, you've taught me so much and always give me food for thought. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
That's all from us. Bye.
Top of the box.
Las Heinz. Down. Sí.